It all started with a slap. The kind of slap that rings in your ears and makes the whole world go quiet for a second. Delilah's cheek exploded in a flash of white-hot pain before her worn leather boot even touched the dirt of Willow Creek. Cyrus Vale, the man whose name was on her mail-order bride contract, had used the back of his hand. Her thin bonnet, a flimsy piece of lace and hope, might as well have been air. Blood, warm and metallic, bloomed at the corner of her mouth. The whole town was watching. Their silence was a roar, a suffocating judgment that pressed in on her from all sides. "This is what happens when a bride shows up late," Cyrus barked, his voice like gravel scraping on bone. His breath smelled of cheap whiskey and entitlement. She wasn't late. Not really. The wagon driver had lost a wheel a few miles back, a freak accident on a road that was more rut than path. But the truth didn't have much currency in Willow Creek. Not when it got in the way of a good show. He yanked her by the wrist, hard, pulling her off the wagon bed. She stumbled, her legs still shaky from the long journey. The folded papers in her skirt pocket, the contract that proved she was his property, felt like a shard of glass against her thigh. It was a receipt for a soul, a transaction nobody here cared to verify. They just wanted the spectacle. "You all wanted to see her," Cyrus bellowed, turning to the crowd of hard, weathered faces. Men in dusty hats, women clutching their shawls, their eyes hungry and cold. "So here's your precious wife." Then he hit her again. This time it was a closed fist to the jaw. The world tilted violently. Her knees gave out and she crashed onto the hard, splintered wood of the feed store porch. A child somewhere in the crowd gasped, a tiny sound of shock quickly shushed. No one else moved. No one else made a sound. Her veil, the one she'd stitched herself, fluttered to the ground like a white flag of surrender. A flag no one in this town would ever honor. Through the dizzying fog of pain, her eyes searched for something, anything to hold on to, a flicker of kindness, a shred of decency. And that's when she saw him. He was standing near the blacksmith's post, a place of fire and iron. He was tall, wrapped in a worn buffalo hide coat that seemed to swallow the light around him. 2 long, dark braids fell down his back. But it wasn't his appearance that cut through the noise and the pain. It was his stillness, an absolute, unshakable stillness that felt older than the mountains. He was Lakota. The town folk had a name for him, whispered in saloons and over sewing circles. Ghost Elk. Not because he was quiet, but because they wished, they prayed. He wasn't real. Delilah lifted her head, the world swimming in and out of focus. Her gaze locked with his. There was no pity in his eyes, no shock, just a steady, burning intensity. It felt like he wasn't just watching, he was memorizing. He was recording every bruise, every flicker of fear, every drop of blood as a debt. Cyrus wasn't done. He grabbed a fistful of her hair, yanking her head back until her neck screamed in protest. He roared about obedience, about a wife's duty, about the decency she had supposedly shamed. He dragged her toward the church steps, the symbol of sanctuary in any other town. Here, it just felt like a stage. "She's going to learn her place today," he jeered, his voice echoing across the silent square. The preacher, standing on the church porch, looked down at his shoes. The women in the crowd pulled their shawls tighter, hiding their faces, hiding their cowardice. Dust devils danced in the street, the only things brave enough to move. Cyrus unbuckled his thick leather belt. The metallic rasp of the buckle was the loudest sound in the world. He was going to do it, right here, in front of God and everyone. He was going to whip her like a stubborn mule to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. He raised the belt high. Delilah closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. She didn't scream. She hadn't screamed when her father sold her contract to the agency. She hadn't screamed when she learned her mother had died alone. She wouldn't give this monster or this town the satisfaction. but the blow never landed. One breath. Two. She dared to open her eyes. Ghost Elk had moved, just one step. He had stepped off the sidewalk and into the dusty street. He held no weapon. He spoke no word. But that single, deliberate step had changed the gravity of the entire town square. It was a challenge, a line drawn in the dirt. Cyrus hesitated. His arm, poised to strike, trembled slightly. He looked from Delilah's bruised face to the silent, imposing figure in the street. The town's collective breath was held in a single, tense moment. What was it? What held him back? Was it the sudden, crushing weight of the town's shame? Or was it the power in those two dark eyes that did not flinch, did not waver, did not look away? "She ain't worth the trouble," Cyrus finally muttered, his voice suddenly thin and reedy. He lowered the belt, his bravado deflating like a cheap balloon. He shoved her hard down the last few church steps. She landed on her hands and knees, the gravel biting into her palms. A wave of thin, uneasy laughter rippled through the crowd. The kind of laughter people use to cover up something ugly they just witnessed, something they allowed to happen. The show was over. The people began to disperse, melting back into the shadows of the storefronts, eager to forget. But Ghost Elk didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, a silent sentinel in the middle of the street, his gaze fixed on her until the last cruel echo of laughter faded into the wind. He was still watching when Cyrus barked, "Get inside, get my dinner ready." She did, because what other choice did she have? The cabin was a tiny, grim box behind the saloon, smelling of stale beer and desperation. Delilah scrubbed her hands at the wash basin, scrubbing them raw, trying to wash away the feeling of 100 pairs of eyes on her skin, watching her humiliation like she was a dogfight. Her lip was swollen to twice its size. A deep, angry ache was settling into her ribs. But that wasn't what haunted her. It was the memory of his eyes, not Cyrus's eyes, full of hate. It was the Lakota man's eyes, the feeling of being truly seen, not with pity, which was just another form of judgment, but with something else, something ancient and knowing, a recognition that went deeper than skin and bone. That night, Cyrus brought his friends over to drink and gloat. 4 loud, grimy men who filled the tiny cabin with their cigar smoke and ugly laughter. Her orders were simple: serve, stay silent, and for God's sake, try to smile. They made crude jokes about her, right in front of her. "She looks better with a bruise," one of them slurred, spitting tobacco juice near her feet. "Gives her character." Another, a pig-eyed man with a greasy beard, offered Cyrus $3 silver. "I'll give you $3 to borrow her for the night, Cyrus. Break her in proper for you." A cup slipped from her numb fingers and shattered on the floor. It wasn't from nerves. It was from a sudden, blinding surge of fury that was so hot it almost choked her. Cyrus was on her in a second. He struck her across the face again, the same spot as before. The cut on her lip reopened, and the taste of blood filled her mouth. But this time, the blood tasted different. It wasn't the taste of defeat. It was the taste of gasoline. And as she staggered back, her eyes flickered toward the open shutter of the window, and she saw him. Across the street, half hidden in the deep shadows of the alley between the general store and the livery, Ghost Elk was standing there. His powerful frame was a silhouette against the moonlight, still watching, still waiting, a silent witness to the slow, brutal unraveling of her life. Was that his purpose? Was he some kind of spirit sent not to help, but simply to remember, to ensure that the cruelty of this place was never forgotten? She turned back to the leering faces at the table, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. She bent to pick up the broken pieces of the cup, and that's when she saw it. Tucked into the rough grain of the wood by the door, so small you'd miss it if you weren't looking, was a feather, a single, perfect feather, half black, half white. A magpie feather. It wasn't a gift. It was a signal. Her fingers trembled as she plucked it from the doorframe. She quickly hid it in the pocket of her apron, pressing it against her hip. The sharp quill felt like a promise, or a weapon. For the first time since setting foot in this hellish town, she didn't feel completely alone, and a tiny, dangerous thought sparked in the darkness of her mind. Maybe he wasn't just a witness. Maybe he was waiting for a signal from her too. The next morning, when Cyrus woke from his drunken stupor and reached for her, his eyes full of groggy menace, she did something she hadn't done before. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry out or shrink away. She simply turned her head and looked directly into his eyes, and she stared at him with the same unnerving, unblinking intensity that the Lakota man had stared at her. And for the first time, Cyrus Vale looked uncertain. Delilah didn't sleep a wink that night. She lay perfectly still on the lumpy, straw-filled cot beside the cold stove, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. But it wasn't the pain that kept her awake. It was the feather. She had it clutched in her hand, hidden beneath the thin, scratchy blanket. She turned it over and over, the smooth texture of the vein, the sharp point of the quill. It felt like a key, but she had no idea what lock it was meant to open. What did it mean? A magpie feather, a bird of secrets, a messenger between worlds. Was it a warning, an invitation, or was it simply proof? Proof that someone had seen her agony and refused to let it be swallowed by the suffocating silence of this town. When the first gray light of dawn seeped through the grimy window, she rose. She moved with a new, deliberate slowness. She braided her hair, not to look prettier for the monster sleeping in the bed, but because her scalp was tender and bleeding where he had yanked it. It was a small act of defiance, a way of taking back control over one tiny piece of her own body. Cyrus didn't notice the braid. He woke up mean, as usual, threw a stale crust of bread at her for breakfast, and stormed out of the cabin, shouting about going to the butcher's to argue about the price of beef. He didn't come back until long after dusk, stumbling through the door, his face flushed with whiskey and rage. But Delilah didn't tremble when he burst in. She was sitting quietly by the hearth, sewing a tear in the hem of her apron. She didn't look up. She acted as if he were nothing more than a gust of wind. Tucked into the fold of the apron she was mending, just visible, was the black and white feather. He saw it. She felt his eyes lock onto it. His drunken tirade about the butcher died in his throat. A dark, confused scowl deepened the lines on his face. He didn't ask where it came from, but the question hung in the air between them, thick and heavy like storm clouds. He didn't touch her that night. He drank himself into a stupor and passed out. It wasn't a victory. It was a ceasefire, and she knew, with a cold certainty, that it wouldn't last. A few nights later, the town decided to have a harvest bonfire, a pathetic attempt at pretending they were a normal, civilized community. It was held in the barren field behind the dilapidated schoolhouse. Delilah was ordered to go, not to enjoy herself, but to serve hot cider to the very people who had watched her beating with hungry eyes. "Wear that old yellow dress," Cyrus had sneered, pointing to a faded, worn-out garment she despised. "And don't you dare embarrass me." She obeyed. She moved through the flickering firelight like a ghost, the heavy tin pot of cider weighing down her arms. But her eyes weren't on the cups she was filling. They were scanning the edges of the celebration, searching the deep darkness beyond the ring of fire, looking for a tall, still figure wrapped in buffalo hide. He wasn't there, or so she thought. The night wore on, filled with the forced laughter and shrill music of a town trying to outrun its own shadow. Then, a commotion erupted near the hay bales. A group of older boys, the sons of the town's most prominent men, had cornered a small child. A Lakota boy, no older than 7 or 8, with wide, terrified eyes. They were pushing him, yanking on his small braids, shouting gibberish at him, mocking his language. "Look at the little savage!" one of them yelled. The other adults just watched, some smiling, others turning away, all of them complicit. And then he appeared. Like he'd been summoned from the earth itself, Ghost Elk stepped out of the shadows. He moved without a sound, a phantom of righteous anger. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He simply walked through the giggling crowd, which parted before him like the Red Sea. He reached the cowering child, gently lifted him by the shoulders, and placed the boy safely behind his own legs. Then he turned his gaze upon the bullies. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. And somehow, that was 1,000 times more terrifying. The boys froze. Their smirks vanished, replaced by pale-faced fear. They stumbled over each other in their haste to get away, melting back into the crowd like the cowards they were. Delilah had watched the entire thing from across the fire, the cider ladle frozen in her hand. For the first time, their eyes met directly. Not across a dusty street during a beating, not through a grimy window at night, but here, in the heart of the town, in the light of the fire. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement. "I saw what you did. I see you." And she could have sworn, in the flickering dance of the flames, that he nodded back. The fire crackled, the fiddle player struck up another tune, and the town went back to its party, pretending nothing had happened. The boys who had tormented the child were already laughing again, chasing girls near the wagons, but the air had changed. The smoke suddenly felt heavier, charged with something more than just ash. Delilah continued to serve the cider, her movements stiff, robotic. Cyrus hadn't laid a hand on her all night, but he was watching her. His stare was a physical weight, a brand on her skin, burning with suspicion and resentment. But for the first time, she didn't feel scorched by his gaze, because she knew someone else was watching too. Ghost Elk was still there, standing just at the edge of the light, a guardian who hadn't yet decided whether to protect or to punish. The little boy he had rescued was sitting on a nearby barrel, his small legs swinging. He was holding a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird in his hands. A gift, no doubt. No one else in this town had hands that steady, that careful. Delilah found herself studying the silent man. No one knew his story. The rumors were wild. Some said he'd lost his family to soldiers. Others claimed he was a great warrior who had chosen a life of exile over one of pointless revenge. All she knew for sure was that he saw the things everyone else tried so hard to ignore, and she was one of those things. The music stopped. The crowd surged toward a long table groaning with pies. In that moment of distraction, Cyrus found her. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "You think I didn't see you?" he hissed, his breath a foul cloud of whiskey and rage. "Looking at him? You think that savage is going to save you? You're mine. I paid for you." She didn't pull away. She didn't cry out. She looked him dead in the eye, her voice low and steady, a strange calm settling over her. "Then why?" she asked. "Are you so afraid?" The question hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't the words themselves, but the chilling lack of fear with which she spoke them. He was so stunned, he actually let go of her arm. She turned, walked back to the cider pot, and continued her work as if nothing had happened. Ghost Elk had vanished again, slipping back into the night as silently as he'd appeared. But she wasn't afraid. She knew he was still close. He was always close. Later that night, when she finally returned to the cold, dark cabin, she was exhausted. She took off her apron to hang it on its hook, and another feather fell out. This one was different. This one was blood red. Delilah held the red feather as if it were a burning coal. It was longer than the first, the barbs smoother, silkier. The color was a deep, terrifying crimson near the quill, fading to a rust brown at the tip. It wasn't a signal anymore. It felt like a declaration. She didn't know the specifics of Lakota symbolism, but she knew the color of blood. and she had a chilling premonition that it wasn't her own blood this feather was prophesying. With trembling hands, she tucked it into a crack in the rough-hewn wooden beam above her cot, a secret omen hidden in plain sight. She stared at it until her vision blurred and exhaustion finally claimed her. The next morning, Cyrus was gone before she woke. He'd left a note scrawled on a piece of butcher paper, going to the telegraph office, business. His anger from the night before had cooled into something sharper, more brittle. She took her time that morning. She built the fire slowly, finding a strange comfort in the simple, rhythmic tasks. Chopping kindling, stirring porridge, breathing. For the first time, the air in the tiny cabin didn't feel quite so suffocating. That afternoon, she took the week's laundry down to the creek at the edge of the woods. It was one of the few chores that got her out of the cabin, out from under Cyrus's oppressive gaze. No one ever followed her. As long as the work got done and she was back before sundown, no one cared where she went. The air under the canopy of the cottonwood trees felt different, cleaner, truer. And there, sitting on a moss-covered stump near the water's edge, was Ghost Elk. He was waiting for her, as if he'd been waiting there forever. He didn't startle when she approached. He didn't even move. He simply watched her with those same intense, unreadable eyes. He held out a small deerskin pouch tied with a leather thong and placed it gently on the ground between them. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knelt and picked it up. The pouch was surprisingly heavy. She loosened the drawstring and peered inside. It was filled with a mixture of crushed roots and dried flowers, their scent earthy and bitter. Tucked amongst the herbs was a small pendant, carved from bone in the shape of a bear's paw. Medicine? Protection? A message? Whatever it was for her. She looked up at him, her throat tight. What did he want in return? What could she possibly give him? Why? She whispered. It was the first word she had spoken to another soul besides her tormentor in what felt like a lifetime. He didn't answer her question. Instead, with deliberate, careful movements, he reached into the leather satchel at his side. He pulled out a folded piece of cloth. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a worn, yellowed page torn from a ledger book. Her breath caught in her throat. Written in neat, cursive ink was her name, Delilah Vale, paid in full. But it was the words scrawled below it, in a different, rougher hand, that made the world stand still. 3 small words that changed everything. Sold, not kept. She stared at the ledger page, her mind reeling. This was a page from her mail-order bride record, the official document that bound her to Cyrus. He had it. Had he stolen it? Bought it back? It didn't matter. He had done the one thing she had thought impossible. He had erased her price tag. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. They weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of pure, shocking relief. When she finally looked back up at him, her voice was a broken, ragged thing. I'm not property. His stare was all the answer she needed. Not here, not now, not anymore. Delilah walked back to town with the bear paw pendant hanging from its leather thong, hidden beneath her dress, and the ledger scrap pressed flat against her ribs, a warm patch of truth against her skin. Every step felt heavier, but it wasn't the weight of fear. It was the weight of knowledge. She wasn't free, not yet. The cage was still locked, but she had just been shown the key, and the shape of freedom, she now realized, looked nothing like the world Cyrus Vale had built for her. He came home late, well after dark, slamming the door so hard the whole cabin shook. He immediately launched into a tirade about the rising price of sugar, as if she were personally responsible for the entire world's economy. She just nodded. She cooked his stew. She swept the floor. She did everything she was supposed to do. But something inside her had irrevocably shifted. There was a new stillness about her, a dangerous calm in the way she moved, in the way she held her head. It was the stillness of a gathering storm. He noticed. Oh, he noticed. It made him nervous, and his nervousness made him meaner. "I have half a mind to send you back where you came from," he growled, slamming his empty cup down on the table so hard it cracked. "See if that agency will give me a refund for damaged goods." She stopped what she was doing. She turned and looked him directly in the eye. Her voice was quiet, devoid of any emotion at all. "They won't," she said calmly. "I'm already used." That stopped him cold. It wasn't the defiance in the words. It was the finality. It wasn't the voice of a victim pleading for mercy. It was the voice of someone stating a simple, unchangeable fact. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, for a long, silent moment before turning away and grabbing his whiskey bottle. Later that night, she stepped outside to empty the basin of dirty dishwater. The moon was high and full, casting long, eerie shadows across the dusty street. He was there, a dark shape against the weathered wall of the stable. Ghost elk. He didn't speak, didn't move closer. He just lifted one hand to his chest and tapped his heart twice with his fingers. Without thinking, without even understanding why, she mirrored the gesture. A silent conversation in the dead of night. It meant something. It meant everything. The next morning, Delilah didn't get up when the sun rose. She let the fire in the hearth go cold. She let Cyrus curse and bang around the cabin, searching for his boots, complaining that the water bucket was empty. She waited until he was gone. Then, just before noon, she rose. She didn't put on her apron. She wrapped her thinnest shawl around her shoulders and walked out of the cabin. She didn't look back. She walked straight to the church. The preacher's wife, a mousy woman with fear in her eyes, looked up in surprise as Delilah pushed open the heavy oak doors. Delilah ignored her. She walked down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the empty, hollow space. She went to the front pew, knelt down, and took a deep breath. From the bodice of her dress, she pulled out the two feathers, the black and white one and the blood-red one. Then she pulled out the ledger scrap. Sold, not kept. She laid them side by side on the velvet cushion of the pew. "I want these buried," she said, her voice quiet, but firm. The preacher's wife scurried over, her hands fluttering nervously. "What is the meaning of this? You can't just—" Delilah wasn't asking for permission. She stood up and walked to the altar. Weeks ago, while being forced to clean the church, she'd found a loose stone in the base, concealing a small hollow space. She pried it open now. She took the two feathers and the scrap of paper and placed them gently inside the dark, empty cavity. A symbolic burial. The death of the woman who had arrived on that wagon. She replaced the stone, brushed the dust from her hands, and turned to leave. As she stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, she saw a small crowd gathered near the general store. They were all murmuring excitedly. She overheard a man say that a new lawman was due to arrive in town any day now. Delilah didn't care about a new lawman. The laws in this town were written by men like Cyrus. She started to cross the dusty road, back toward the cabin that felt more like a prison cell than a home. On instinct, she glanced toward the line of trees at the edge of town. And there he was. Ghost Elk was on horseback now, a second horse trailing behind him on a lead rope. He was sitting perfectly still, watching her, waiting. He wasn't there to rescue her. He was there to ride beside her, if she chose to ride. That night, she didn't pack a bag. She had nothing she wanted to take with her. She left the worn-out dresses, the cracked boots that blistered her feet, the apron that smelled of servitude. She left behind everything that belonged to Delilah Vale. Cyrus was passed out on the bed, snoring, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the floor beside him. She didn't leave a note. What was there to say? That she was never his to begin with? That she had been sold but never truly bought? that the only person she belonged to now was herself? She walked out of the cabin barefoot into the cool night air. The only thing she carried was the bear paw pendant, which she had tied around her neck. She walked to the edge of town, to the creek that bordered the woods. Just beyond the cottonwood trees, he was waiting. Ghost Elk sat astride his dark horse, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. The second horse stood patiently beside him. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply reached down and offered her his hand. She hesitated, just for a single, thundering heartbeat. This wasn't a fairy tale rescue. This wasn't a romance. This was a terrifying risk. She was leaving behind everything she knew, even if what she knew was a living hell. She was stepping off the edge of the map into a world she couldn't even imagine. Then she took his hand. His grip was strong and firm, but patient. It was the grip of a man who knew how to gentle a wild horse that had only ever known a whip. He easily pulled her up, seating her behind him on the broad, warm back of his horse, and they rode. They didn't ride fast, not like they were fleeing. They moved with a steady, purposeful rhythm, heading away from Willow Creek, away from the pain and the silence. They rode past the jagged ridge where the wind always seemed to change direction. They rode past the spot on the road where the broken wagon wheel still lay half buried in the dirt, a monument to her brutal arrival. They rode past everything she was, and everything she was leaving behind. They didn't speak for miles. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was a language of its own, the language of two people who had seen the worst of the world and didn't need to explain their scars to be understood. Just before the sun began to bleed over the eastern horizon, they crested a high rise. Below them, a wide green valley unfolded, cradled by gentle hills. A river snaked through it, glinting like a silver blade in the pre-dawn light. Small plumes of smoke curled up from a cluster of teepees. Ghost Elk reined in his horse. He pointed down into the valley. "Wakpawashte," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. It was the first time he had ever spoken directly to her. She tasted the strange, beautiful words on her tongue. He saw her confusion. "Good river," he translated. As they watched, the village below began to stir. The soft sound of dogs barking, the faint, high-pitched laugh of a child. Even from this distance she could smell wood smoke, the scent of cedar and roasting corn. It smelled like life. She swallowed against a hard lump in her throat. Will they accept me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer with words. He just gently nudged his horse forward, and they began the slow descent into the valley. As they drew closer, people began to emerge from the teepees. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They simply watched their approach with curious, cautious eyes. An older woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, stepped forward from the crowd. She was holding a heavy, woven blanket, rich with colors and patterns. Without a word, she came to the side of the horse, reached up, and wrapped the blanket around Delilah's shoulders. It was heavy. Heavy with stories Delilah hadn't yet learned. But it felt warm. And it felt strong enough to carry hers. She wasn't home. Not yet. But for the first time in a very long time, she was no longer a stranger. But just when she thought the story was over, she would learn that her escape from Willow Creek wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning of a much darker, more twisted truth. And the silent man who had saved her had a secret of his own. A secret that was buried under the very foundations of the town she had just fled. She thought she had escaped a monster. She was about to find out she had only escaped his cage, and the real monster was the town itself. Delilah soon learned that life in Wakpawashte was governed by a different kind of currency. Nothing was offered out of pity. Every bowl of hot stew, every mended stitch, every place by the warm evening fire had to be earned, not through bloodlines or marriage contracts, but by simple presence. by contributing. She didn't speak the Lakota language, beyond the few words Ghost Elk taught her on their journey, but she quickly discovered that hands and eyes could form a language all their own. The women of the village, seeing her willingness, took her under their wing. They taught her, through patient demonstration, how to soften a deer hide until it was as supple as cloth. They showed her how to braid sweetgrass, how to grind wild sage to make a calming tea, how to read the clouds for signs of rain. The children, who in Willow Creek would have run from her or thrown stones, were curious and unafraid. One afternoon, a small girl with mischievous eyes, whose name was Taya, came and sat beside her. Without a word, the girl took a simple beaded bracelet from her own wrist and slipped it onto Delilah's. "Now it fits," the girl said, in clear, practiced English, and then ran off, laughing. No one asked about her past. They didn't need to. Her haunted eyes and the faded yellow-green bruises on her skin told a story that needed no words. Here, scars weren't a mark of shame, they were a testament to survival. Her silence, which in Willow Creek had been a sign of weakness, was respected here. It filled the spaces where pointless explanations would have gone. Ghost Elk did not hover over her. He didn't treat her like a fragile, broken thing he needed to protect. He resumed the rhythm of his own life, coming and going from the village as he pleased. Sometimes he returned with fresh meat slung over his shoulder, other times with bundles of medicinal herbs, and sometimes with nothing but the scent of pine and distance clinging to his clothes. But every time he returned, his eyes would find hers across the bustling camp. And in that shared glance, there was a quiet, powerful understanding that anchored her to this new reality. One night, after the evening meal, the whole village gathered in a large circle under a sky littered with stars. The elders began to tell stories. They spoke of a time before the white man's iron rails had scarred the land, a time when spirits walked the earth in the form of deer, and when powerful singers could make the sky weep with their drums. Delilah sat on the outer edge of the circle, feeling like an intruder. But the old woman who had given her the blanket, whose name she learned was Wanacha, beckoned her forward. "You have fire," the old woman said, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. She gently tapped Delilah's chest with a crooked finger. It just needed air. Then, Wanacha reached into the central fire, and with her bare, leathery fingers, she plucked out a single glowing coal. She held it out to Delilah. It was an honor, a gesture of inclusion that Delilah didn't fully comprehend, but the weight of it was immense. Trembling, she cupped her hands and accepted the coal, its heat a searing, cleansing pain. She held it for a moment, then, following the old woman's nod, passed it to the person next to her. Later that night, unable to sleep, she walked down to the river, the good river. She knelt at its bank and finally let herself weep. But these weren't the hot, shamed tears she had cried in the cabin. These tears felt clean. They were a release, a washing away of the woman named Vale. She didn't hear him approach, but suddenly Ghost Elk was there, sitting on the riverbank a few feet away. He didn't touch her, didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just sat with her in the quiet darkness. After a long time he spoke, his voice a low whisper. "I knew you would stay." She turned to him, her face illuminated by the moonlight. "I didn't think I would want to," she confessed softly. "You weren't ready then," he replied, his gaze fixed on the water. "Now you are." And looking at his strong, stoic profile, a profile lined with a strength she was only beginning to understand, she had a profound realization. This was not the man who had rescued her. This was the man who had made it safe enough for her to rescue herself. The fragile peace she had woven around herself, this new life stitched together with kindness and quiet dignity, was torn apart 2 weeks later. He came at midday, a lone rider on a tired horse, a white man. He wore a dusty coat, and pinned to it was a tin badge that was half hidden by a lapel. He had the weary, hollowed-out look of a man who wasn't chasing justice, just completing a task. He didn't ride into the village. He stopped at the edge, by the river, and the effect was immediate. A hush fell over Wakpawashte. The laughter of children died. The rhythmic thud of a woman beating a hide ceased. The entire village stilled, like a herd of antelope sensing a wolf on the wind. Delilah had been rinsing freshly gathered herbs in the cold river water when the little girl, Taya, came running, her face pale with alarm. "Man is here!" she panted, grabbing Delilah's wet hand. "He wants names!" Delilah's blood ran cold. Cyrus. The name was a venomous snake in her mind. He hadn't given up. She dried her hands slowly on her skirt. The urge to run, to hide, was a physical thing, a clawing panic in her chest. But she forced it down. She had run once. She would not run again. She walked from the riverbank toward the center of the village, where Ghost Elk was now standing beside two of the tribal elders. The man with the badge was holding a folded piece of paper. His eyes found her immediately as she approached. There was no cruelty in his gaze, just a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "Delilah Vale?" he asked, his voice flat and tired. She just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Your husband Cyrus Vale back in Willow Creek, he's filed a report," the lawman continued, his eyes flicking from her to Ghost Elk and back again. "Claims you were taken, abducted against your will by this man here." A bitter laugh almost escaped her lips. Abducted. The irony was suffocating. She finally found her voice. "He beat me," she said, her words clear and steady. "In the middle of the street, in front of the whole town." The lawman nodded slowly, unsurprised. "I heard as much. But it's still his word against yours, and the law, such as it is out here, it doesn't bend much for a woman or for a Lakota." He unfolded the paper in his hand. "The fact is, I have a warrant. I have orders to bring you back." Ghost Elk said nothing. He didn't move a muscle, but the air around him grew heavy, charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Delilah looked at the official paper, then at the tin badge, then at the faces of the people who had shown her more kindness in 2 weeks than she had known in her entire life. She looked at Taya, who was hiding behind Wanakcha's skirt, peering out with wide, fearful eyes. "If I go back," she asked the lawman, her voice low, "what happens to him?" She nodded toward Cyrus. The officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You'll testify. The judge might listen. Maybe Cyrus serves a few months in a territorial jail. Maybe he just pays a fine. The town seems to like him. They'll protect their own." "And if I stay?" she asked, the question hanging in the air like a death sentence. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Then it gets messy," he said quietly. "Real messy. He'll send more men. Bounty hunters, maybe. It won't end until he has you back or someone's in the ground." Delilah took a deep, shuddering breath. This was it. The choice. Go back to the cage, or bring the violence of the white man's world crashing down on this peaceful village. Then she remembered. The ledger scrap. The proof. She reached into the bodice of her doe-skin dress and pulled out the small, folded piece of paper Ghost Elk had given her. The paper that had become her declaration of independence. She held it out to the lawman. He took it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He unfolded it. He read the neat, elegant script. Delilah Vale, paid in full. Then he read the 3 jagged words scrawled beneath it. Sold, not kept. The lawman's jaw twitched. He read the words again, and a flicker of something, understanding, disgust, crossed his face. He looked from the paper to her, then over at Ghost Elk, who was watching him with an unnerving intensity. The lawman let out a long, slow breath. "It ain't right," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "None of this is." He carefully folded the ledger page and handed it back to her. Then he took the warrant from his pocket, the warrant for her return, and slowly, deliberately, tore it into pieces. He let the scraps of paper flutter from his fingers and be carried away by the wind. "I'll ride back to Willow Creek," he said, his voice firm now, "and my report will state that I couldn't find you, that you vanished without a trace." He tipped his hat to the elders, gave Delilah one last, long look, and turned his horse around. He rode away without looking back, a lone figure disappearing into the vast, indifferent landscape. No guns had been fired. No blood had been shed. Just a choice, a truth, and a good man who decided, for one day at least, that justice was more important than the law. As the dust from his horse settled, Ghost Elk finally spoke, his voice filled with a quiet respect. "You gave him truth," he said. Delilah looked at him, the ledger scrap clutched tightly in her hand. A small, brave smile touched her lips. "You gave it to me first," she replied. But as she watched the lawman disappear, a cold, unsettling thought began to form in her mind. The phrase on the ledger, "sold, not kept," it had saved her. But what did it really mean? It sounded like a business term, a cold, final stamp on a failed transaction. But Ghost Elk had given it to her with such gravity, and the lawman had reacted with such disgust. It wasn't just a refund notice, it was something more. It was a code, and she suddenly realized that the story of Willow Creek wasn't finished with her. She had escaped, but she hadn't understood. The evil in that town wasn't just one cruel man. It was a system, a secret, and the phrase, "sold, not kept," was the key. A key to a truth far more terrifying than a simple beating in the street. The departure of the lawman should have brought relief. Instead, it left Delilah with a gnawing, restless unease. The village of Wakpa Washte celebrated that night. They saw the torn warrant as a victory, a testament to her strength and the lawman's decency. But Delilah couldn't shake the feeling that she had only survived a single battle, and the war was far from over. The words echoed in her mind. Sold, not kept. It was a code. She was sure of it. It was the kind of cold, efficient language used to track livestock or cargo, not people. What kind of mail-order bride agency used terminology like that? What did it mean when a woman wasn't kept? A few days later, she found the courage to ask Ghost Elk. They were sitting by the river, mending a fishing net, their hands moving in a comfortable, familiar rhythm. "The ledger page," she began, her voice low. "The one you gave me. Where did you get it?" He didn't look up from his work. "From a dead man's pocket," he said simply. A chill traced its way down her spine. "Who was he?" "A rider from the agency. He came through here last spring. He got lost in a blizzard up on the ridge. My cousins found him after the thaw." "And the page?" she pressed. "Was it mine?" Now he stopped. He set down the wooden shuttle and turned to face her. His eyes were dark and serious. "No," he said. "It belonged to a woman named Sarah Blackwood. She was sent to Willow Creek 2 years ago." "What happened to her?" Delilah whispered, though she already knew the answer. No one in town had ever mentioned a Sarah. "She wasn't kept," he said, his voice flat and hard. There it was again. That phrase. Delilah's heart hammered against her ribs. "What does it mean?" she pleaded. "What does it really mean when they aren't kept?" Ghost Elk picked up a smooth, flat stone from the riverbank. He stared at it for a long moment before he spoke. "It is a sickness in that town, a secret they all keep. Cyrus Vale is not the only monster. He is just the one they let you see." He told her the story then. A story pieced together from whispers, from observations, from years of watching the poison of Willow Creek seep into the land. The mail-order bride agency wasn't just a matchmaking service. It was a supply chain. Willow Creek was one of its special clients. The men in that town, the powerful ones, the preacher, the general store owner, the blacksmith, they had a pact. They didn't want wives. They wanted workers. They wanted bodies to cook, to clean, to bear the brunt of their cruelty, to be used up and discarded. When a woman became too defiant, too broken, or too sick to be of use, she was not kept. "What do they do with them?" Delilah asked, her voice trembling. Ghost Elk looked toward the distant hills that separated this valley of life from that town of death. "There is a place in the woods behind the church," he said softly. "A place with many unmarked stones. Sarah Blackwood is there, and before her, a woman named Mary, and before her, another named Anne. I do not know all their names, but the land remembers." Delilah felt sick. The air, which had seemed so clean and fresh just moments before, now felt thick with the ghosts of murdered women. She wasn't just a survivor of domestic abuse. She was an escapee from a slaughterhouse. Cyrus's beatings weren't just random acts of rage. They were a test, a process of breaking her spirit, of grinding her down until she was a mindless, obedient shell. The public humiliation, the starvation, the constant terror, it was all part of the system. And the feather, the red feather. It hadn't been a prophecy of Cyrus's blood. It had been a warning about the fate that awaited her. "Your father," Ghost Elk continued, his voice pulling her from her horrified thoughts. "He did not just sell your contract. He sold you to them specifically, for a higher price. He knew what that town was." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her own father. He hadn't just gotten rid of her, he had knowingly sold her to her death. But then, a new, more terrifying question emerged. "But why?" she choked out. "Why would a whole town do this? It's insane." "It is more than insanity," Ghost Elk said, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient sorrow. "It is a ritual, a penance for a crime their fathers committed. A crime that soaked the ground Willow Creek was built on with innocent blood." He told her the final, darkest piece of the puzzle. Years ago, before the town existed, a band of peaceful Lakota had lived on that land. His people. They were not warriors, they were farmers and artisans. A group of white settlers, led by the preacher's father and Cyrus Vale's father, wanted the fertile land. They didn't want to trade for it. They didn't want to buy it. They came in the night. They massacred every man, woman, and child. They burned the village to the ground and built their town on the ashes and the graves. But the guilt, Ghost Elk explained, festered. It became a sickness of the soul. They became haunted by what they had done, and in their twisted, terrified minds, they concocted a horrific penance. They believed the land demanded a sacrifice. The spirits of the murdered Lakota women needed to be replaced, so they began to buy new women. And when one was used up, they sacrificed her to the land, a continuous bloody ritual to appease the ghosts they themselves had created. "My own aunt was among the slain," Ghost Elk said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was just a boy. I hid, I watched, and I have been watching ever since. I have been waiting for someone strong enough to not just escape, but to help me burn their secret to the ground." Delilah stared at him, her mind reeling. The silent observer, the mysterious guardian. It was all a lie. He wasn't just a witness. He was an avenger. And he hadn't just saved her. He had chosen her. He had been testing her, just as Cyrus had, waiting to see if she had the fire he needed to finally get his justice. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. The bonfire. The little Lakota boy. "The boy you protected," she said. "Was he?" "He is my nephew," Ghost Elk confirmed. "His family are among the few other survivors of the massacre. They live in the hills. They watch, as I do." Another memory. The preacher flinching when Ghost Elk spoke a Lakota word. "What did you say to him?" "I spoke the name of my aunt," he said. "The one his father murdered." It all clicked into place. The town's complicit silence, the preacher's cowardice, Cyrus's bottomless rage. He wasn't just a brute. He was a product of this generational sickness, a prince born to a kingdom of blood and lies. "The lawman," Delilah said, a new dread dawning. Cyrus didn't report me missing because he wanted me back. He did it because he was panicking. My escape broke the pattern. It threatened to expose everything. Yes, Ghost Elk agreed. And the lawman who came, the one who let me go? Ghost Elk looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something she couldn't quite read in his eyes. He was not the first lawman to come to Willow Creek asking questions. The others, they did not leave. The blood drained from her face. The kindly, tired man who had torn up her warrant hadn't just been doing a good deed. He had been walking into a trap, and she had let him go, armed with nothing but a flimsy story about not being able to find her. "He's in danger," she breathed. "They'll kill him." "They will try," Ghost Elk said. "We have to help him. We have to warn him." "How?" Ghost Elk countered, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to her rising panic. "You cannot go back there. They will kill you on sight, and if I ride in, I will be starting a war I cannot win alone." "Then what do we do?" she cried, her newfound freedom feeling like a different kind of cage. She was safe here, but her conscience was screaming. She couldn't just sit by while another innocent person was fed to the monsters of Willow Creek. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had learned to soften hides, to serve cider, to bury secrets in a church. She thought of the lawman's tired eyes. She thought of the ghosts of Sarah and Mary and Anne. "There must be a way," she said, her voice low and determined. "They have a ledger, a record of the women. You said the writer you found had a page. That means there's a book. In the town. If we can get that book?" Ghost Elk looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of something akin to hope in his dark eyes. "The book is kept by the storekeeper, a man named Peters," he said. "It is under lock and key. It is their most guarded secret." "Then we have to get it," she said, a cold, hard resolve solidifying in her heart. The fire that Wanaka had spoken of, the fire that had been fanned by Ghost Elk's revelations, was now burning hot. She was no longer Delilah Vale, the victim. She was no longer even the quiet survivor in Wakpawashte. She was something new. She was a weapon, and she was about to be aimed at the heart of the town that had tried to bury her. Her plan was insane. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only way. "I'm going back," she told Ghost Elk. For days, Delilah and Ghost Elk planned. They spoke with the elders of Wakpawashte and with the families of the other survivors who lived hidden in the hills. This would not be an act of war, but an act of justice. A careful surgical strike to extract the poison from Willow Creek. The lawman, whose name they learned was Marshall Reed, was their unwitting bait. Cyrus and the others would be focused on him, on silencing him before he could report back. That would create the distraction Delilah needed. Ghost Elk gave her a map, drawn from memory on a piece of scraped hide, showing the layout of the town and, most importantly, the general store. He also gave her a knife, small and sharp, with a handle carved from antler. "This is not for fighting," he told her, his voice grim. "It is for cutting your way out if you are trapped." The most crucial part of the plan came from the old woman, Wanaka. She prepared a small pouch of herbs. "This is not a poison that kills," she explained, her ancient eyes sharp and intelligent. "It creates a sleep like death. A few drops in the well behind the store. It will give you the time you need." The night before she was to leave, Delilah sat by the fire, the antler-handled knife in her lap. She was terrified. Every instinct screamed at her to stay in the safety of the valley, but the faces of the lost women, Sarah, Mary, Anne, were burned into her mind. She could not rest until their story was told. Ghost Elk came and sat beside her. For a long time they said nothing. "There is one more thing you must know," he finally said, his voice low. "About Cyrus." Delilah braced herself. What else could there possibly be? "His mother," Ghost Elk said. Her name was Eleanor. She was not a mail-order bride. She was the preacher's sister. When she discovered what her husband and brother were doing, the ritual they had started, she tried to stop them. She tried to help one of my people escape. He paused, his jaw tight. They caught her, her own husband and brother. They said she had gone mad with grief and shame. They locked her away. She died in that cabin you lived in. Cyrus was just a boy. They told him his mother had abandoned him, that she had run away because she was weak. They raised him on that lie, fed his anger, and molded him into the monster he is today. He does not know he is continuing the very crime that killed his own mother. The revelation was staggering. It didn't excuse Cyrus's cruelty, but it cast it in a new, tragic light. He was a puppet, his strings pulled by the sins of his father. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because knowledge is a weapon," he replied, "and you may need every weapon you can find." She left before dawn, dressed not in the Lakota doeskin, but in the drab, worn-out dress of a settler woman, her hair hidden under a simple bonnet. Ghost Elk and two of his cousins rode with her, silent shadows in the darkness, until they reached the ridge overlooking the town. From there, she would go on alone. "The marshal rode in yesterday," Ghost Elk whispered, pointing toward the town. "He went to the saloon. He has not come out. They have him." Delilah's heart pounded. The trap was sprung. "Be a ghost," Ghost Elk said, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. "Go unseen." She slipped down the ridge and into the woods that bordered the town, her movements silent and practiced. She was no longer the clumsy, terrified woman who had stumbled off that wagon. She was something else now. She crept to the back of the general store. The well was just as Wanacha had described it. With trembling hands, she emptied the pouch of sleeping herbs into the bucket and lowered it deep into the water, churning it to mix the powder. It was done. Now, she had to wait for darkness. She hid in a thicket of overgrown bushes, her eyes fixed on the back door of the store. Hours crawled by. The sun set, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and purple. Lights appeared in the windows of the saloon, and she could hear the faint sound of rough laughter and music. They were celebrating. They thought they had won. Finally, the back door of the general store creaked open. The storekeeper, Peters, a portly man with a perpetually sweaty brow, emerged to smoke his pipe. A few minutes later, the blacksmith joined him. Then the preacher. They were all there, the leaders of the conspiracy, gathering in the shadows. "The marshal is taken care of," the preacher said, his voice low and smug. "He's tied up in the cellar. No one will miss him for days." "What about the girl?" Peters asked nervously, wiping his face with a handkerchief. "What if she talks?" "Let her talk," the blacksmith grunted. "Who would believe a runaway bride and a pack of savages over us? Besides, Cyrus is out with a posse, looking for her. By the time he gets back, the marshal will be gone, and the girl's story will be nothing but ravings." They spoke for a few more minutes, then went back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. This was her chance. Delilah took a deep breath, clutching the antler-handled knife. She slipped from her hiding place and crept to the door, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. She peered through the crack. The three men were sitting at a small table, playing cards and drinking from a jug of what she assumed was water from the tainted well. She waited. It felt like an eternity. Then, one by one, their movements became sluggish. The blacksmith's head lolled to the side. The preacher slumped forward, his face hitting the table with a soft thud. Peters was the last to go, his cards slipping from his limp fingers as he fell into a deep, unnatural sleep. It had worked. Her heart hammering, Delilah pushed the door open and slipped inside. The store smelled of pickles, leather, and dust. She moved quickly, silently, to the counter where the ledger was supposed to be. A heavy iron lockbox was bolted to the floor beneath it. Locked. Of course. She frantically searched the sleeping men's pockets, looking for a key. Nothing. Panic began to set in. The sleeping potion wouldn't last forever. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for anything she could use to pry the box open. Then she saw it. On a high shelf behind the counter, almost hidden in the shadows, was another smaller wooden box. It wasn't locked. She climbed onto the counter and carefully lifted it down. It was filled with old papers, receipts, and letters, and at the very bottom, tucked inside a leather-bound diary, was a small, ornate iron key. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the iron box, and there it was, a thick, leather-bound ledger. She opened it. The first page read, Registry of Goods, Willow Creek Account. She turned the pages, name after name, Sarah Blackwood, Mary O'Connell, Ann Spencer. Beside each name was a date of arrival, and then, a few months or years later, another entry in that same jagged scrawl she recognized from her own stolen page. Not kept. Not kept. Not kept. It was a meticulous record of their murders. 27 names, 27 lives bought, used, and discarded. But as she reached the last few pages, her blood ran cold. There were other entries. Payments. Not just to the mail-order bride agency, but to someone else. A name she recognized, her father's. He hadn't just sold her once. He had been a supplier for them for years, finding desperate, friendless women and selling them to Willow Creek. He was as much a part of the system as the preacher or Peters. A blinding, white-hot rage filled her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She wanted to burn the store down. She wanted to burn the whole town to the ground. But she heard Ghost Elk's voice in her head. Knowledge is a weapon. She couldn't take the whole ledger. It was too big, too heavy. She used her knife to carefully slice out the pages containing the names of the women and the payment records to her father. She tucked the damning evidence into her dress. She had what she came for. Now she had to free the marshal. She slipped out the back door and crept through the shadows toward the saloon. The front was loud and boisterous, but the back was quiet. She found a small, barred window that looked down into the cellar. Peering through, she could see him. Marshal Reed was tied to a chair, gagged but conscious. His eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and fury. The cellar door was thick oak with a heavy iron bar across it. There was no way she could get through it. She had to think. What would they do with him? They wouldn't keep him here. They'd move him. They'd take him out to the woods and bury him with the others. She hurried back to the woods at the edge of town, her mind racing. She found Ghost Elk and his cousins, waiting patiently in the darkness. She quickly explained everything, showing him the ledger pages. A dark, grim look settled on his face as he saw the list of names. It was worse than he had ever imagined. They will move him at moonrise, Ghost Elk said. When the rest of the town is asleep, they will use the preacher's wagon. We can't just attack them, Delilah said. They'll be armed. The marshal could be killed in the crossfire. We will not attack, Ghost Elk said, a cunning light in his eyes. We will hunt. They set their trap on the old logging road that led from the back of the town into the deep woods. It was a place of dark, tangled trees and deep shadows. They worked quickly, silently, stretching a rope across the road at horse height. Just as the moon reached its zenith, they heard the telltale creak of wagon wheels. The preacher was driving, with the blacksmith beside him. The marshal, still bound and gagged, was in the back, covered by a canvas tarp. The wagon drew level with the hidden rope. Ghost Elk gave a signal. His cousins, hidden on the other side of the road, pulled the rope taut. It caught the two men at neck level, ripping them from their seats with shocking force. They hit the ground hard, stunned and winded. Before they could recover, Ghost Elk and his cousins were on them, silent and swift as ghosts. They were disarmed and bound with their own ropes before they could even utter a cry. Delilah rushed to the wagon and pulled back the tarp. She quickly cut the marshal's bonds with her knife and removed his gag. He scrambled to his feet, rubbing his raw wrists, his eyes wild. Who are you? He stammered, staring from Delilah to the Lakota warriors who had appeared from the darkness. I'm the woman you came to arrest, she said, handing him his gun. Then she pressed the stolen ledger pages into his hand. And this is the evidence you need to arrest this entire town. He stared at the pages, his face growing paler and paler as he read the list of names. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of horror and awe. My God, he breathed. My God. But their victory was short-lived. From down the road back toward the town came the sound of shouting and galloping horses. A voice, raw with fury and confusion, cut through the night air. It was Cyrus. The posse had returned, and they had found the sleeping men in the general store. They knew. They were trapped. Cyrus and his posse, at least a dozen riders, thundered down the narrow logging road, their torches painting the trees in a hellish, flickering light. They were a wave of armed, angry men, and Delilah, the marshal, and the 3 Lakota warriors were caught in its path. There's too many of them, the marshal yelled, cocking his pistol. We can't fight our way out. We do not need to fight, Ghost Elk said, his voice a calm anchor in the swirling chaos. He grabbed the reins of the preacher's wagon. Get in, he commanded. Delilah and the marshal scrambled into the back of the wagon. Ghost Elk leaped into the driver's seat and with a sharp cry whipped the horses into a gallop, deeper into the dark woods. His 2 cousins vanished back into the trees like smoke. The posse was right behind them, their shouts and gunshots echoing through the forest. Bullets splintered the wood of the wagon, one whizzing past Delilah's head so close she felt its heat. Where are we going? She yelled over the thunder of the hooves and the gunfire. To a place they dare not follow, Ghost Elk shouted back. The road grew narrower, rougher. The wagon bucked and swayed, threatening to shatter with every jolt. The trees closed in around them, their branches like grasping claws. It was clear this wasn't a road meant for a wagon. Then, ahead of them, Delilah saw a terrifying sight. The road ended. It opened into a small, dark clearing that ended abruptly at the edge of a deep, shadowy canyon. A chasm. It's a dead end, the marshal cried, his face pale in the torchlight. He's trapped us. Cyrus and his men were closing in, reining in their horses at the entrance to the clearing, their figures silhouetted against the light of their own torches. They had them cornered. It's over, savage, Cyrus screamed, his voice cracking with a strange mixture of rage and desperation. Give me the woman. Give me my wife. Ghost Elk brought the wagon to a screeching halt just feet from the canyon's edge. He stood up in the driver's seat, turning to face his pursuers. He was completely calm. She is not your wife, he called out, his voice clear and powerful, echoing in the clearing. She was never yours. Delilah knew this was it, the final stand. She clutched the antler-handled knife, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But then, something impossible happened. From the trees on either side of the clearing, and from the far side of the canyon itself, figures began to emerge. Dozens of them. The Lakota families from the hills, the survivors. They stepped into the torchlight, men and women, old and young, their faces grim and determined. They held no guns, but many carried bows or hunting spears. They formed a silent, menacing ring around the clearing. Cyrus and his posse froze, their triumphant smirks vanishing. They were no longer the hunters. They were the ones who were surrounded. This is our land, Cyrus Vale, a voice called out. It was Wanaka, the old woman, standing on the opposite side of the chasm. Her voice, though frail, carried an immense authority. You have spilled enough blood on it. Cyrus stared, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning primal fear. This wasn't just a confrontation with a few savages. This was a reckoning with the ghosts he and his father had tried to bury. In that moment of shocked silence, Delilah knew what she had to do. This couldn't end in a bloodbath. It had to end with the truth. She stood up in the back of the wagon, her legs trembling, but her voice steady. "Cyrus!" she called out. His wild eyes found hers. The hatred in them was still there, but it was mixed with confusion, with pain. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "This is about them." She pointed to the ledger pages in the marshal's hand. "It's about Sarah, and Mary, and Anne. And it's about your mother, Cyrus. It's about Eleanor." At the mention of his mother's name, something in him broke. A flicker of the lost, betrayed boy he had once been. "What do you know of my mother?" he snarled, but the bite was gone from his voice. "I know she didn't abandon you," Delilah said, putting all the force of her newfound strength into the words. "I know she was murdered. By your father, in the same cabin where you kept me. She was killed because she tried to stop this. She tried to save the people your father destroyed." She took a deep breath. Ghost Elk's people. She died trying to save his family. A deathly silence fell over the clearing. The men in the posse looked nervously at each other, then at Cyrus, then at the silent, watching Lakota. The foundation of lies upon which Willow Creek was built was cracking, shattering, right here in this dark clearing. Cyrus stared at her, his face a mask of agony. He looked at the preacher, who was now being held by one of Ghost Elk's cousins, his face ashen with guilt. He looked at Ghost Elk, who was watching him not with hatred, but with a profound, sorrowful pity. The truth, when it finally hit him, did not come as a whisper. It came as a tidal wave, wiping out his entire world. The rage, the hate, the bitterness he had carried his whole life, it had all been a lie, a tool used to shape him into a monster. He wasn't avenging his mother's abandonment. He was honoring her murderers. He let out a terrible, guttural cry, a sound of pure animal grief. It was the sound of a soul tearing itself apart. He dropped his gun to the ground. He slumped forward over his horse's neck, his body shaking with racking sobs. The fight was over. The posse, their leader broken, their dark secret exposed, offered no resistance as the Lakota warriors moved in and disarmed them. Marshal Reed, his face set like granite, stepped forward. "Cyrus Vale," he said, his voice official and cold. "You and every one of these men are under arrest, for murder, for conspiracy, and for crimes against humanity that I don't even have a name for yet." The aftermath was swift and absolute. Marshal Reed, with the help of the Lakota, rounded up every man involved in the conspiracy. The ledger pages were irrefutable proof. The story of Willow Creek, when it finally came out, sent shock waves through the territory. It was a story of such profound evil that many refused to believe it. But the graves behind the church, once they were unearthed, told the story in bones. Cyrus, a broken man, confessed to everything. He gave testimony that damned his father's legacy and the entire foundation of the town. His fate would be decided by a federal judge, but Delilah knew his real sentence would be a lifetime of living with the truth. Her father was arrested weeks later, 1,000 miles away. The ledger pages she had cut out were his undoing. Delilah did not stay to watch the slow, painful process of justice. Willow Creek was a graveyard, a place of ghosts. She had no desire to see it reborn. She returned with Ghost Elk and his people to the valley of the Good River. Wakpa Washte. One morning, months later, after the first snows had fallen, she was called to the lodge of the council elders. She entered barefoot, her hair braided with sweetgrass. Inside, Ghost Elk stood by the fire, waiting. Wanaksha, the old woman, burned sage, its purifying smoke filling the lodge. "You came to us with no name," she said, her voice soft but strong. "The name they gave you was a brand, a mark of ownership. You have burned that brand away. You walked back into the fire and did not flinch. You gave a voice to those who had been silenced." She scattered a handful of dried wildflowers into the flames. "That name is dead. The spirits of this valley, the spirits of the women you freed, they give you a new name." The lodge was silent. "Wiyaking Wing," the old woman declared. Quiet Flame. The name settled over her, not like a blanket, but like a second skin. It felt true. It felt like her. Later that night, she and Ghost Elk stood on the ridge overlooking the peaceful, sleeping valley. The stars were bright and cold in the winter sky. "You never asked me to stay," she said, the question she had held in her heart for so long. He looked out at the vast, silent land. "To ask you to stay would have been to build another cage," he said, "and you were born to be free." She nodded, understanding at last. He hadn't rescued a victim. He had waited for a warrior to find her own strength. "Then I will build my fire here," she said, her voice quiet, but burning with all the strength of her new name. And she did. She built a life, not on the ashes of her past, but on the firm, good earth of her future, a life of her own making, a life of peace, a life of flame. If you were moved by the story of Quiet Flame and her fight for justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more true-hearted tales from the forgotten corners of history. We all face our own versions of Willow Creek. What gives you the strength to fight back? Let us know in the comments below.